Five Below means hot stuff, cool prices. Get the trends in your feed for way less. Candy, beauty, tech, room decor, and more. Plus extreme value finds in our 5 Beyond shop. Yup, you could say we're kind of a big deal. Shop in stores and fivebelow.com.
Hello and welcome to Outward. I'm Christina Cauterucci, a senior writer at Slate, and I hope you've all spent this Pride Month reveling in our beautiful community, recommitting to the fight for queer liberation, and gracefully navigating the intersections of all your various polycules at your local Pride parties. This year at Pride, I've been particularly impressed by the queer fashions I've seen out and about. And it seems like there's a much wider variety of what people are wearing these days than in many Prides past. This is a very anecdotal, unscientific observation, but I think people are getting sexier. We're doing every possible variety of mesh. We're doing under boob. We're doing side boob. We're doing the tried and true top boob. We're doing tank tops with unbelievably explicit sayings on them. And that's just at my house at the Friday night pregame. It's been so exciting to see people out this year. I missed last year's Pride because I had COVID. I love getting dressed up and seeing people look cute. But I also know that the clothing of queer women and the people who love them has often been diminished or overlooked. In cultural histories, lesbian fashion has been a punchline or no line at all. So it always feels like a treat when I can notice trends in my queer circles because I get to think about why we wear what we wear and what it says about who we are. Lucky for me, and for you, there's a new book out this month that has really scratched that itch. It's called Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion. It's written by Eleanor Medhurst, and I'm thrilled to have Eleanor with us today to talk about it. We'll chat after the break. The Human Rights Campaign envisions a world where every member of the LGBTQ+ family has the freedom to live their truth without fear and with equality under the law. Equality for all, without exception. Pride is a time to celebrate the LGBTQ+ community. We create spaces where we can bring our whole selves to dance and march in the streets and declare, we are here. We are proud. Last year, the HRC declared a national state of emergency for LGBTQ+ Americans in recognition of the record-breaking number of anti-LGBTQ+ bills signed into law, as anti-LGBTQ+ politicians and judges are up for election. Across the country, anti-LGBTQ+ legislators are taking their marching orders from extremist groups and are determined to tell their LGBTQ+ constituents that they should not be seen, heard, or even exist. This Pride Month, let's fight back against all the hate and celebrate the LGBTQ+ community. Donate today by visiting hrc.org/givepride. Make a generous gift this Pride Month and support the LGBTQ+ community. Have you heard the term nuclear family? The phrase was coined by an anthropologist in the 1920s to describe the family structure of a straight married couple and their kids. Now, over a century later, only about 18% of Americans actually live in a family by that definition. That means that over 82% of Americans represent different kinds of family. From This Is Actually Happening comes The 82% Modern Stories of Love and Family, a special 6-part series focused on those who have broken away from the norm and challenge society's notions, from an asexual educator and activist raising a child with 2 other co-parents, to a gay man in the clergy who chose the path of celibacy and created a unique family unit with his straight best friend. Each episode offers an intimate first-person perspective from those whose family lives have taken different shapes. To listen to the 82% series, follow This Is Actually Happening on the Wondery app, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can listen to This Is Actually Happening ad-free on Wondery Plus.
Everyone has a white whale. The one that got away. This is mine. It's December 7th, 2014. Around 1 a.m. The night of the attack.
There's gas. So is there like a gas leak or is there...
We don't know what the fuck it is. We got people vomiting blood.
Rosemont police say an intentional chlorine gas leak has sent 19 people to the hospital.
You're telling me that there was a terrorist attack in 2014 involving the use of chemical weapons, but nobody heard about it?
This could not have been an accident.
People were eager to assume that it was some sort of hate attack.
I've gone through all the theories. I think there's only one that fits.
Yeah, you have to read this story.
Fear and Loathing, out now wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, welcome back. Eleanor Medhurst is the author of Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion. She's a historian of lesbian fashion and the author of the blog Dressing Dykes. This is her first book, and it explores what queer women and trans people have worn through the ages, all the way from Sappho's tunics to that person wearing a vest with nothing under it and a necktie as a necklace at the Dyke Bar in 2007. It's an extremely fun and actually quite moving read, and it gave me a lot of new ways to think about how queer people have always used fashion to find each other and to create a sense of self. So I'm so thrilled to have Eleanor here today to talk about the book. Eleanor, welcome to Outward.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So great to meet you. So you write in the intro of Unsuitable that because lesbians have had to hide themselves throughout much of history, there weren't really fashion trends the way we see them kind of rise and fall in mainstream culture. So how do we define lesbian fashion in history as apart from just what lesbians happened to wear?
I mean, lesbian fashion in history can be like so many things. And that's something that I really tried to tackle in the book, is trying to tell the story of lesbian fashion while not limiting it to any one form of expression or any one community or culture. I think that often what it comes down to is lesbian fashion history even being looking at lesbian history through the lens of clothing. So understanding lesbian history by analyzing the clothes that lesbians or people who we might consider lesbians, even if they didn't use those exact terms, understanding their lives and how they expressed themselves in the world, how they related to mainstream society and also their own lesbian or queer communities through their dress and what that meant to them. So
yeah, I mean, the book is really clearly not just a fashion history the way people might think of it in the most shallow sense. It's really a history of lesbian identities and cultures and subcultures, because clothes are often, maybe the most important, but definitely the most visible part of how people express their gender too and find each other. It's also about like the construction of lesbian identities. Do you have a favorite moment in lesbian fashion history or a favorite lesbian fashion icon?
I mean, it's so hard to like try and have a favorite just because there's so much out there. It's kind of like picking a favorite child. I don't know. What I do like, though, is some of the symbols or the codes that have been used at various points in history, just because they're kind of distinct and specific and they often have such interesting stories around them. And one of my favorites, just because it's really camp, is the monocle. Mm-hmm. And the monocle was an accessory worn by many upper class or more wealthy lesbians in communities in Europe, in Western Europe, in the early 20th century, particularly in around the 1920s. And this was a period when kind of slightly masculine, boyish fashions were in fashion in like the mainstream for all women. But lesbians really, really like held on to this. Mm-hmm. And monocles were like a staple of it. And I just think they're so fun. There's on the cover of my book even is a photograph taken at a lesbian bar called Le Monocle. It was taken in 1932, and a bunch of the people in the crowd are wearing monocles as well. And it's just like, yeah, it's a fun item. It's got such an interesting history around it, and it's like on the cover of the book. So that's up there.
And I love that a monocle feels so impractical. Like, I'm sure there is a practical purpose to one, to like only have a lens on one eye, but feels like you'd have to kind of like tense up your face to keep it on. And yeah, I mean, I just love like whimsy and frivolity, and this seems like just the most uncomfortable thing you could wear. That also makes me love it. Like, wow, people were really suffering for fashion, and they looked really good.
They were committed to the look.
So why did you choose to start with Sappho. This seems really hard to me because there are no photos of her. So we actually don't have, a ton of actual information about how she dressed.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started with Sappho it's in a section of the book. The book split into like thematic parts. And the first section is We Were Always Here. So it's talking about lesbians have always been here in many different contexts and have dressed in particular ways. And obviously Sappho, we have such limited information about her. Even the surviving poems that we have are just fragments of verse. And while there aren't many descriptions of clothing or accessories or presentation at all, really, there are some little hints that come through, such as violets. Violets are a recurring theme in her poetry, and obviously love for women as well, so they go hand in hand. But why Sappho was interesting and why the kind of perspective that I took with looking at her was in her reinventions and the way that people have used the look that they associate with Sappho or they think she might have worn, such as like tunics and then violets, of course, and using that and wearing that look or including that look in things like paintings to solidify the idea that lesbians have always been here. And this is something that people for a long time have been wanting to state and to show, to say, yes, we've always been here. Look at Sappho. So yeah, it's kind of the sapphic look, TM.
It also, I didn't realize until reading your book how much lesbians sort of in between us and Sappho really identified with her and used violets and were sort of inspired by her works or what we know of her. Yeah,
definitely. Especially, again, I've already mentioned the 20s, but in the 1920s, there were so many like amazing creative things going on in lesbian and queer communities across the world. And in Paris, in, I think, 1926, there was a play called The Captive that used the symbolism of violets and of a lesbian couple exchanging bunches of violets to show their relationship. And apparently the story goes that lesbians in the audiences pinned violet flowers to their lapels when they went to see the show as a kind of badge of solidarity. So
it's so good. It's like people wearing their little pink cowgirl hats to the Chapel Roan concerts now.
Exactly. Yeah.
We've always been the same. Speaking of the 20s and 30s, I think one thing your book does really well is illuminate how queer progress has really been far from linear. You know, there were times of pretty extraordinary freedom and visibility, if not legal rights, in, the 20s and 30s that then gave way to this era of more intense repression in the 40s and 50s. So in the long 20s, which is what you're talking about in Paris, in Weimar, Berlin, there were multiple lesbian magazines. I think you write more than 50 lesbian clubs, which boggles the mind. And
I know, it's like, how can that be possible?
Yeah.
50 in one city. We don't have that now.
Like, yeah, and haven't maybe ever had that in any time since. And I know, trans lesbians were also a pretty visible and integrated part of that scene. What do we know about how fashion played into sort of the construction of that lesbian scene?
Yeah, I mean, in that interwar period in Berlin, it was, as you said, such a thriving queer community, such a thriving lesbian community, with all of the bars, with the magazines that were being published. Two lesbian publications in particular, Die Freundin and Frauenliebe, were such big hits at the time, and they were a really important source for me. There's a lot of issues of them have been archived digitally, which is amazing. And there's often articles in them talking about how you should dress in a way that, like, to be visible or to be your true self, whether that be in a boyish masculine way or often for people who called themselves transvestites at the time, but who we might now recognize as being transgender, possibly transgender lesbians, depending on their community. Sometimes there were articles about dressing in a way that was more feminine and how to get the right kind of handbag and things like that, and having these almost like an agony aunt aspect in these magazines. I think that people have an image in their heads when it comes to like 20s fashion of like the flapper, and that's definitely part of it, that sort of 20s glamour, the Great Gatsby kind of glamour. And some of that was definitely seeping into queer spaces and lesbian spaces alongside this masculine look and the boyish look and cropped hair and suits and high collars. And there was such a freedom of expression going on and such a dialogue about it as well.
And I know at the same time, the Harlem Renaissance was going on in New York, which so many of the star performers in that scene were lesbians. What was it about that period that made people so excited about these sort of often transmasculine performers?
Honestly, I think that part of it is that this was a period that came after the First World War, which in many contexts was a time when women or people socially seen as women were allowed to be independent for the first time and often were working in factories, things like that, were wearing trousers or pants. And that was for many people a freedom that they weren't willing to go back on after the First World War ended. So that's kind of the overarching themes that were going on as life rolled into the 20s. And yeah, in Harlem, there were such an array of incredible queer female performers, including Gladys Bentley, an incredible male impersonator who dressed in fantastic, like sleek tuxedos and top hats on stage, and apparently also just walking the streets of New York with like her girlfriend at the time on her arm. So fantastic, such an icon. And yeah, I just think it was people were ready for something new and people wanted fun and people wanted almost deviance, like a bit of rule breaking.
Yeah, Gladys Bentley, I love the chapter on them because I think they're a really, really good example or sort of visual representation of how there was this escalating clampdown on queer sexuality and gender in post-war America. Can you explain sort of what happened to Gladys Bentley in their presentation?
Yeah, so Gladys Bentley's, the peak of their career was really in the 20s and 30s and kind of the 40s as well, but going into the late 40s into the 50s with McCarthyism in the US, there was a big pushback against any kind of gender variance, especially. There was the Lavender Scare, as it's now known, and the US government was really pushing back against anything that was outside of the box, I suppose, anything that might be different. And again, this is like a post-war reaction. This is post-World War II when women or people seen as women had some more freedoms. And that was like suddenly, oh, we don't want to go back to all of that frivolity and freedom that was going on after World War I. And yeah, in the early 50s, Gladys Bentley really had to tone down their performances, especially. I think some of their performances were shut down and they weren't allowed to perform as a male impersonator, so kind of a proto-drag king anymore. And they started performing as still a singer and a pianist, but wearing much more feminine clothes and dresses, flowers in their hair. And they actually wrote an article published in Ebony magazine titled I Am a Woman Again. And that kind of cemented that they were doing things correctly. They were being right in the eyes of the world and the government and kind of the law, I suppose. And I don't think that they ever really changed who they were at their core. But something about Gladys Bentley is that, yeah, they were very, very aware of what they needed to do to survive and thrive in the context that they were living in at any particular time.
Yeah, it's a really, tragic story. You describe it as almost a, forcible detransition where they're like sort of made up and their hair is done in a feminine way. And even I think posing with men, it just seems like a real tragedy of that era to see this person who really thrived in their masculine presentation be forced into this box like so many other people of that era.
Yeah, I think that when looking at lesbian history and queer history more broadly, it is difficult sometimes because not all stories had happy endings necessarily, but yeah, obviously that doesn't make them any less important to tell. And that doesn't mean that the joy and the power and the rebellions that they had in their life weren't important, even if they had to step back at any point.
Yeah, definitely. Let's take a pause for a quick break. We'll be right back.
What's the history of cannabis legalization? It traces back to San Francisco's 1980s AIDS crisis. We hear from a pioneering AIDS doctor on how cannabis was helping patients, and from the woman running the biggest cannabis operation in San Francisco at the time.
I never felt, oh, I'm going to get AIDS and die. I just felt like I can be of some help.
This is AIDS and Cannabis, a 3-part series on how to do the pot. Listen wherever you get podcasts.
One reason why lesbian fashion is so fascinating to me is, as a femme lesbian, I feel like I have a very, very keen eye for what makes fashion queer in ways that I think mainstream fashion or just cis hetero people don't. I can sort of spot a femme lesbian, and I see the ways that we play with our gender in queer ways. In your research, how have you thought about finding femme lesbians and analyzing what they wore?
Often it's quite difficult certifiably finding femme lesbians or even just more feminine lesbians in historical research because they don't have that obvious, that person's dressing really differently. You have to look more closely a lot of the time. So often the representations of femme lesbians in history have been if they're on the arm of a butch lesbian or if they're in a lesbian bar, a lesbian space. So you can go, yes, they are gay, tick. But it's still really important to look further than that and to say that feminine lesbians in many different forms have always been there, from femmes in the mid-century in the bar scene to when invert was a popular term in the early 20th century. There was the pairing of the pseudo-invert and the congenital invert, and the pseudo-invert was kind of a earlier form of the femme lesbian, of the feminine partner in a masculine and feminine couple. And then there are obviously times when there have been feminine lesbians, femme lesbians who have not been in a masculine and feminine pair. And they're still visible in there and doing particular things with their clothing. And often, as I think it still is today, sometimes those particular things will be they're being particularly kind of hyper feminine in what they're wearing, or particularly knowing about their uses of femininity, or they'll maybe step back from femininity a little bit and be a bit more butch in any particular situation to go, look, I'm gay, I'm here. And then be like, but I prefer dressing in a feminine way, so I'm going to bring that back. So it's kind of just looking at the intentional nods to queerness that feminine lesbians have made in their dress in different contexts at different points.
Yeah, it's very much, I think, feels like the difference between dressing feminine because that's what you're supposed to do and doing it because it's a choice, and really picking and choosing what parts of it resonate with you, which is what makes it so powerful and exciting to me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's femininity not for the male gaze at the end of the day.
Yeah. On the topic of the male gaze, I loved the section on lesbian feminists in the 60s and 70s and their sort of uniform of work shirts, jeans, often no bra, no makeup, short hair, really sort of deliberately saying screw the male gaze. We're not going to be necessarily masculine or feminine. It's going to be more androgynous. But really, they were concerned with we're not dressing for men, which really feels like the main difference between lesbian fashion and sort of mainstream fashion, which a lot of traditional fashion advice for women has been about how to compliment a man or attract a man.
Yeah. Definitely. I think that obviously during the lesbian feminist movement with these very androgynous clothes and the push for all sort of lesbians to wear these androgynous clothes, for some people that was very difficult and it was very excluding if that's not how they wanted to present themselves. But I do think it really deserves recognition and respect, because without that kind of push and that pioneering towards women can wear things that are in quotes ugly, I think we wouldn't have so many of the freedoms that we have today in how we dress.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was really interesting too. You write about the racial dynamics of that look and how sort of racially exclusionary can that be. Can you explain that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, what I was looking at in particular in that section especially was the ways that Black lesbians in the UK, was kind of my main point of reference, would often be bringing in clothing or accessories from whatever their cultural heritage was, and dressing in a way that didn't completely align with this like androgynous uniform, which was all jeans, t-shirts, overalls, boots. It would sometimes be more than that. It would sometimes be different. And also another thing that came up was that sometimes the androgynous kind of practical look could seem scruffy or like not fully put together, and that for many Black lesbians or lesbians of color, they had to present themselves in a way that seemed more respectable to the world in order to live more safely and to be more respected in turn. So sometimes for Black lesbians in this context, the clothing pressures, the clothing rules almost of the movement could be very restrictive and exclusionary.
I also think it's interesting, this comes up in several different chapters, the line that people had to walk, and still do in many cases, between sort of flagging enough to find other lesbians and advertise yourself as a lesbian, but also not standing out so much that you raise alarms and, are ostracized from society. I know Anne Lister I think of as somebody who did this a lot, and maybe other people this was the wealthy English woman who I think became most famous with the BBC HBO series Gentleman Jack in the early 1800s. Can you explain sort of how somebody like her walked that line?
Anne Lister is such a fascinating example because, especially with Gentleman Jack recently, she's become such an emblem of lesbian history. And, she was living in the early 19th century, the early 1800s, and she was so aware of the way that she was dressing and how it reflected on her lifestyle and how it reflected on her personal life and her personal relationships as well. But because she was a landowner, she was an entrepreneur, she wanted to be, again, respected, but by the upper class world around her, I suppose. So she was kind of walking this line between, I want to be different, I want to be more masculine in my presentation, I want to be admired by other women, but I also want to have a good place in society and I want to be able to make money. And what's interesting about her is that the only reason we know so much about her life is because she left millions of words worth of diary entries, which she, I think, hid in a wall of her home, Shipton Hall, and they were eventually found. At one point earlier, they were found and then shoved back in the wall again. But when they were found and decoded slowly, it was like there was suddenly this insight into lesbian history, but that it wasn't always clear cut. Like Anne Lister had a very complicated life. And I think that her clothes are very illustrative of those complications.
I was amazed reading about some of the things that were so subtle and would seem meaningless to us now, but meant something at the time, like an umbrella strap, like a leather umbrella strap that maybe was so masculine that people would be like, oh my gosh, Anne Lister's wearing a leather umbrella strap.
Yeah.
What a butch,
Yeah, exactly. It's like at that period, the line between masculinity and femininity was so clear. It was such a harsh divide. And one of the only ways that women at the time could be more masculine was by wearing riding habits. So these were clothes that would typically be worn for riding horses. And these were a lot more tailored. They were kind of slightly inspired by military coats. And Anne Lister would sometimes wear clothes like this, but she also wrote about meeting some other lesbians or people who we might call lesbians who would just be wearing these riding habits in their day-to-day, even though they weren't horse riding, because it was a way that they could be masculine and it would be okay.
That's wild. It's almost inspiring to hear about people doing that, like finding ways to survive in their era and still feel like they're expressing themselves and looking like themselves.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd be curious to know about your own personal relationship with lesbian fashion. What does fashion mean to you in your life?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing about my own fashion is that I wear a lot of pink. I've got pink hair. Yeah. And I have been for many, many years now. And at this point, it's kind of just second nature to me, but I've thought about it a lot over the years and about how pink in particular is it's a color with a lot of baggage. Like there's a lot of gender associations tied to the color pink. And I think just in my own personal life that wearing pink as a lesbian and as a very loud lesbian is kind of subverting expectations around it and subverting expectations around femininity and dressing for men. And femininity doesn't mean what people might think it means. Like, I'm wearing pink and I'm really, really gay. So that's one thing in my own personal kind of style. But I also, through doing lesbian fashion historical research, I think that I am more and more aware all the time of references that I make in my own dress and references to lesbian culture today, perhaps, but also lesbian symbols in the past. Obviously, I mentioned monocles. I'm not going to bring a monocle into my clothes, but the violet, like I've got a little enamel violet pin, which I sometimes wear, and things like carabiners.
Yeah, is that a carabiner on your necklace?
Oh my God, it is. Yes.
That was so good. I was like, oh, that's the dykiest necklace I've ever seen.
Yeah, exactly. Like wearing a carabiner in a way that isn't useful. It's like a very intentional nod to like the carabiner's lesbian history.
I really want to send you this photo. I will after this taping of a top that I got for Pride this year that closes in the front with a carabiner. So it is technically useful in that it's keeping my shirt together, but and then, obviously another one on my belt loop, but like that's the functional one. And the one on my shirt is the decorative one.
Yeah, it's like inventive practicality.
Yes. So good. How has the internet changed lesbian fashion and also our sort of understanding of lesbian fashion?
Honestly, I think that the internet and like social media in particular has really made people, I think, more aware sometimes of what they're doing with lesbian fashion and how they can do certain things with their own clothes in order to like flag, I suppose. I recently wrote an article talking about the kind of revival of historical lesbian symbols online and particularly on TikTok, using like the comments that I get on my own TikTok videos as kind of a case study. Because as a lesbian fashion historian, I will post videos about, this aspect of lesbian fashion history, monocles, for example. And then there'll be comments going, we should bring back the monocle. And then with things that are more accessible, such as violets, there's comments going, yes, I've got a violet tattoo because of this. And then more people find out about it in turn and are like, I will now recognize that as a symbol, or I'm going to do that myself. And I think that there's more of a dialogue about why we dress in particular ways because of online spaces.
When 100 years from now, somebody writes another book on lesbian fashion history, what will they say about this moment?
Oh my God, who knows? I think carabiners are definitely, they're getting more and more cemented every day, I think. Because obviously carabiners and like the ring of, people love them. People are like, yeah, my carabiner. And I think there's more like recorded about them now than there ever has been. So possibly carabiners. I think also like overalls or dungarees. Again, a staple and a kind of lesbian stereotype that's been around since lesbian activists in the 70s, 80s, but still going strong again. I also think the kind of the almost like lesbian chic revival that's happening with like celesbians, I guess, like Kristen Stewart is kind of gonna be the figurehead of what was happening at this moment. And I think that in many ways she already is in various news articles and stuff like that.
Yeah. This is Kristen Stewart's standing invitation to come on the podcast.
Yeah.
To talk about her fashion, among other things.
That would be amazing.
I wonder if there's any person who you met in your research, person from history, or any sort of, mini lesbian fashion moment that you think not enough people know about and that you're so excited to introduce them to in your book?
Honestly, there's a lot of them. I think that some of the stories in the book are definitely more well-trodden ground. Something that I've already talked about a little bit today is the possible trans lesbians in interwar Berlin. Particularly one of the examples that I was looking at was a woman called Emmy Muller who wrote a letter to one of these lesbian magazines that was going at the time. And she called herself a transvestite. I think she was in her late 50s or mid 50s in the late 1920s in Berlin. And she was living publicly as a man and had like quite a official position, a public figure, possibly in politics. And Emmy Muller wrote to this magazine writing all about her life and about how she'd always wanted to dress in women's clothes and how she'd always been very feminine but never had a way to express that. But once she met her wife, they built like her feminine wardrobe of her dreams together. And then once she found the magazine that she wrote to, she really, like, her world opened up and she found this lesbian world that she could be part of. And I think that some of the most important figures that you find in queer histories are the people who weren't famous, the people who weren't performers or rich or, that there aren't extensive records of, but you can just find a bit of their story. And it's kind of proof that regular people living queer lives and living lesbian lives have been existing and living for a long, long time.
That's one reason why I'm so grateful for historians and also librarians and people who preserve this stuff, because it's really the sort of finding of those not famous people in history and bringing them to life in a story it's beautiful work, and I appreciate it so much.
Yeah. Me too.
That's all the time we have. Eleanor, thank you so much for joining us. Again, Eleanor Medhurst is the author of Unsuitable, A History of Lesbian Fashion. Eleanor, you're the best.
Thank you.
That's our show for the week. Thanks so much for listening. You can always find us at outwardpodcast@slate.com. You can send us feedback, your topic ideas, or any queries you might have. And just a reminder that by joining Slate Plus, you could get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on shows like Working, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. To learn more, go to slate.com/outwardplus. Our show was produced by Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, and rate and review the show so other people can find it. Happy Pride, everyone, and stay gay.